Welcome to the Hearthguys Tour Guide to the Skyrim Civil War. Just the beginning of what will likely be several explorations into Elder Scrolls world building across my channel, and a good place to start in understanding the underlying conflict of the, as of recording, most recent game, Skyrim. The Civil War and the greater narrative connected to it is perhaps the biggest missed opportunity in Skyrim's story, and the one with the biggest implications for all Elder Scrolls going forward. But for all I could say, I've already said it across 3 videos that have been compiled here for ease of access, and for those who like listening to me like a podcast with no need to click from one video to the next. Either way, I hope you enjoy. Skyrim and I are old friends. It was one of, if not my very first video game of any substance, at least when I could actually comprehend what I was doing. From the plains of Whiterun to the forest of Falkreath and the Rift, the mountains of the Reach and Hoffingar, and the frozen stormcloak-infested hellscape of literally every other part of this Talos-forsaken country. Important use of words there. Despite the name of the video, I'm actually not an Imperial fan. 9 divines out of 10, I'm joining the Stormcloaks. Whether that's because I have a distinctive hatred for anything even loosely associated with the Thalmor, because the current Cyrodiilic Empire is a heaving, gasping corpse that needs to die already so something new can be born, because I have Scandinavian heritage and some part of me longs for the ice and snow of the north, or just because Ulfric is an actual character while General Tullius is a walking, talking recruitment poster. Who can say? Regardless of why I'd side with them, you'll usually find me kicking Imperial dogs down and teaming up with my fellow sons and daughters of Skyrim for some good old-fashioned Nordic fun. But does that mean as a faction I think they're actually capable of maintaining Skyrim in the long term? Well, let me be pedantic and answer that question with another question. Can you feed an army on snow and dreams? Come along, friends, as I explain exactly why the Stormcloaks are not winning this. Besides my previous pedantic statement, there's a number of reasons to think the Stormcloaks' new regime would collapse within years without direct help of the Dragonborn. In fact, I'd argue the Stormcloaks have more of a chance of killing Lord Harkin or Alduin themselves than actually beating the Empire. The Stormcloaks are settled in the eastern half of the country, centered around Windhelm and Ulfric's base of power. Windhelm and its hold, Eastmarch, is 1 part ice and 1 part volcanic geyser field. Besides lumber and the occasional farm, Eastmarch alone isn't providing much in the way of raw materials for the war effort. The Pale has ore and used to have trade from the north, but good luck getting any of that done with the Empire having the only navy out of the 2. Not to mention Vermina screwing with the populace. The Rift is a big breadbasket, the largest in Skyrim in fact, and having that providing for the Stormcloaks is a massive boon. But the Rift is also beset by poor management, corruption, poverty, and the only thing in all of creation worse than Maroon's Dagon or more like Bhaal, Maven Blackbriar, who has the city so deep in her pockets that it might as well be her own little plane of oblivion. And of course Winterhold is about as useful as Morthal, but at least Morthal has something of a population to back up the local Imperial conscripts. And they are conscripts, if any of you didn't realize that. The actual Imperial legions aren't really in Skyrim. There's some of them, to be sure, but not enough to fight this civil war. The lore reasons for that is that the passes between Skyrim and Cyrodiil that are the primary way to enter the country are blocked up by avalanches and snow from the winter, and because the Empire is busy diverting troops elsewhere in preparations for the Second Great War that is no doubt coming. The Aldmeri Dominion called the Great War the first war with the Empire, so you'd better believe a second one is coming. Ulfric knows this, Tullius knows this, Titus Mead knows this, everyone with half a brain knows this. I've heard arguments that Ulfric is just a tool for the Thalmor, and while you can make arguments that many of his actions directly benefit the Altmer, I don't think he's 100% helpful to them. The Thalmor dossiers found in the MC explicitly state they want this war to go on as long as possible, while Ulfric wants it done and over with as soon as possible. Not to mention that there's nothing preventing a new independent Skyrim from allying with the Empire when the next Great War comes along. So it's beneficial to the Thalmor to keep this war going so tension and grudges last longer as well. Yet another thing Ulfric is trying to prevent. That's because he's probably very aware of how tenuous their position is. The moment those southern passes clear up, the Imperials could swarm the province in a matter of months, and no amount of fiery speeches about the Thalmor would stop that. The Imperials and Thalmor employ battle mages that cave their skulls in with magic ice spikes or cook them in their own armor, while the Stormcloaks, common Nords that they are, fear magic like the plague. They barely tolerate the College of Winterhold, and that's probably because they're afraid it could blow up what's left of the city. And to be fair, it probably could. I wouldn't put it past them, the whole place is filled with lunatics and morons with inferiority complexes. Added to the fact that the Thalmor are technically on the side of the Imperials with this one, and their information network put anything the Stormcloaks could pretend to have to shame. That said, it's not like the Stormcloaks are in a completely doomed ship, just one headed for an iceberg. There are some factors that could steer them away from that, the big one being, well, you, the Dragonborn. Surprise, surprise, having an avatar of Akatosh, Dragon God of Time, and possibly an aspect of Lorcan who can rewrite the laws of physics by yelling loud enough on your side is a pretty big win condition in a war of attrition. Who needs siege engines when you can ask the Dragonborn to just drop a mountain of cheese for your boys to crawl over? Want someone dead? No worries, the Dragonborn is already the Thane of every hold in Skyrim, he can do whatever he wants. Want a way to rally even more angry Talos worshippers to your side? What better than an actual Dragonborn, just like Tiber Septim was? But I'm not talking about the obvious reasons. Anyone could take Skyrim over with a literal soul-devouring demigod on their side. The Khajiit could if they tried hard enough. Ulfric actually has a couple other ways to steer his ship towards victory, although they're more unlikely, and at least one of them is a little bit based off of what can only be described as vibes. The first thing is their favor in something more historically relevant, and I mean real-world history, not Elder Scrolls history. Well, maybe that one too, I don't know. Guerrilla warfare has historically been exceptionally effective when a larger, more conveniently powerful force is trying to conquer a region they have little experience in and have difficulty accessing. Americans saw it in Vietnam, and we saw it way back in the Revolutionary War when we were the ones doing it. I don't care how many magic missiles your mage is firing, if you're trying to fight an enemy that knows the lands better than you do, you might as well pray to whichever of the 9 divines you still actually believe in that said enemies don't have booby traps in every last inch of ground between you and them. The next thing is fairly obvious. Whiterun. Take Whiterun and you basically have the run of all Skyrim. We see that in-game with whatever side you pick. Whiterun has large open fields with plenty of viable farmland and positions to attack the neighboring holds. Falkreath is pretty much already captured if the Stormcloaks manage to take Whiterun, and that offers even more lumber and raw resources for the war machine, and would almost guarantee a Stormcloak win. Naturally, the question of how they'd capture Whiterun is also important. Balgriff, cool guy he may be, is not going to side with Ulfric, so the act of taking Whiterun will be a bloody one. However, the Stormcloaks are more than capable of doing so if the Empire isn't involved. Noticed how I said if the Empire isn't involved. Hold on to that, I'll get to it in a moment. It doesn't hurt that Ulfric's no idiot. He knows this war won't be won on dreams alone. He actively says that without Whiterun, the rebellion isn't going to be doing much besides being an annoyance to the Empire, which is why it takes him so long to actually start the war properly. By the time of Skyrim's start, Ulfric hadn't really started the Stormcloaks' war effort in earnest, as he was holding out for as many of his fellow Jarls to join his side as possible. And by fellow Jarls, I mean Balgriff specifically. Balgriff is a character that deserves his own video, but suffice to say that Ulfric had respect for the man, especially since he stood his ground when it came to not choosing a side. But that particular stance wasn't very advantageous to Ulfric, and he was the one on a time limit. So he sends his axe to Balgriff, and the Civil War of Skyrim gets real toasty. What happens from there is subject to the player's interference, but no matter what, Balgriff will side with the Empire. By siding with the Empire, Balgriff throws Ulfric's whole plan into jeopardy. If you've been paying attention, you know why Ulfric needs Whiterun, but it's that same reason that the Empire also needs Whiterun. By joining the Imperials, Balgriff basically opened the door to the Stormcloak Rebellion and Windhelm itself, leaving Ulfric no choice but to attack immediately. The Battle of Whiterun is the most important moment in the Civil War, because whoever wins that battle wins Skyrim itself. The battles of Solitude and Windhelm for either side really amount to just putting a thrashing animal down. Whiterun is the real deciding factor. And let's not pretend the whole of Whiterun is united. Even in the city itself, you'll find a solid 2/3 are more pro-Stormcloak than Imperial, including Yorlin Greymane, the smith of the Companion's Skyforge. Push comes to shove, you better believe that the Greymane's connections are going to be a thorn in any Imperial attempt to keep the hold. In fact, Riverwood, the hold's source of lumber, is basically run by Stormcloaks already, with Gerdur and her family. A former Blade runs the inn, and even the blacksmith who has family in the Imperial Legion isn't lifting a finger to help anyone if the old blues come a-marching in. I firmly believe that if Ulfric really wanted, he could have attacked Whiterun whenever he wanted, and from there he'd be poised to cut the Empire's presence in Skyrim at the knees. Whether because he can now attack almost every Imperial-leaning hold from Whiterun, he has the Skyforge churning out borderline magical weapons for his army, or simply because Whiterun's resources could reinvigorate the rebellion tenfold. Taking and holding Whiterun would go a long way to debilitating the Empire. but that'd require him not demanding Balgruuf pick a side and giving him the chance to run to the Empire. Needless to say, if it was just Whiterun alone, the Stormcloaks win no question, but with the Imperial forces backing them up, Whiterun becomes the gamble of all gambles, at least from Ulfric's point of view. And judging by the title of the video, you can guess what I think would be the outcome of that, or at least the most likely one. It wouldn't be impossible, and if Ulfric planned it right and had enough defectors from Whiterun itself, he could pull it off. I mean, look at the Greymanes. But those are some rather hefty win conditions, and even if he did pull it off, the Stormcloaks would be absolutely wrecked. The Imperials wouldn't fare much better, but they're the ones in the defensive positions in the Battle of Whiterun, so it would take far less casualties on their side to secure a victory. Even a draw amounts to a win when you're on the defense. Now, to further explain the final point, we need to actually cover everything that led up to the rebellion's start, and where we are at the beginning of the game, which really starts about 15 years before the events of Skyrim during the Markarth incident. During the Great War in the year 174 of the Fourth Era, the Forsworn took the opportunity left by the sudden recall of Imperial legions to Cyrodiil as the Empire was busy putting up the best fight it could, which required all the help they could get, particularly from Skyrim. Because of this, the Forsworn's uprising began and was successful practically overnight, with the at the time Jarl of Markarth, Hrolfdir, and his son Igmund being run out of the city. Meanwhile, Ulfric's Stormcloak, fresh from the Great War, being imprisoned and no doubt tortured by the Thalmor, was probably itching to work off some steam. During his imprisonment by the Thalmor, Ulfric was gaslit into believing that info that he spilled directly led to the capture of the Imperial city, despite the fact that the city had already fallen by the time this had happened. In case you needed further proof that Thalmor as a faction are somehow less redeemable than the Dark Brotherhood. With all that pent-up anger, when the Jarl of Markarth reached out and asked Ulfric to help him take back the city and promised free Talos worship as a bonus, Ulfric was raring to go. And boy did he go, retaking Markarth and the Reach almost instantly. Afterwards, he reinstated Jarl Hrolfdir and called it a day. From there, accounts vary, but from what can be gathered, Jarl Hrolfdir went to town seeking out every last Forsworn that hadn't been scattered to the hills by Ulfric's initial attack. And anyone that worked or vouched for them were either imprisoned or executed, and by some Forsworn accounts, this included women and children. And while we have no reason to disbelieve some of these claims, none of them suggest Ulfric was the one responsible. Now, before any of you Forsworn apologists try yapping at me in the comments, trying to tell me that the Bear of Markarth clearly states that the Forsworn ran a peaceful kingdom before Ulfric walked up and murdered them before declaring himself King of Markarth, while these saintly Imperials wanted to make peace with them and Ulfric, I'll remind you that the same guy who wrote that also wrote Mad Men of the Reach, in which the obviously Imperial author tries to paint the Hagraven-worshipping, heart-replacing, civilian-slaughtering bunch of savages as misunderstood rebels that just wanted freedom. Both of these books are propaganda to make you think Ulfric bad and Forsworn/Imperials good, and you fell right into it, you fools. Shortly after Hrolfdir and Ulfric had sorted this whole mess out, the Imperial Legion arrived to finally restore order, only to find their job already done, with Ulfric demanding they recognize Markarth's right to freely worship Talos. To which the Empire said, "Alright, sure." See, at this point the Empire was only superficially enforcing the ban on Talos worship and just hoped the Dominion wouldn't find out. They found out. And when given the option, they chose to scapegoat Ulfric to prevent another war so soon after the first one. Call it cowardly if you want, but I can't really blame the Empire for going with this route. They barely survived the First Great War while also losing Hammerfell. They were in no position to stand up to the elves, and so they got Hrolfdir to betray Ulfric and his militia and have the whole of them captured, not realizing they just ensured the Stormcloak Rebellion's existence. After all that nonsense, Ulfric then suffered a personal tragedy as his father, Jarl Hogue, died while his son was in prison, and Ulfric had to smuggle out a eulogy for his father via letter. As you can imagine, when he arrived back in Windhelm to the people mourning Hogue's death, and spiteful at the Old Merry Dominion, Ulfric's tolerance for the Empire and the Elves had finally snapped, and he began talking about independence even in front of High King Torrig. Torrig himself was a complicated person. There's even a bit to suggest mutual respect between Ulfric and Torrig. You could make the argument that Torrig would have done as he asked if Ulfric had actually asked, as well as evidence to suggest Torrig was a Talos worshipper. But that's not really important, as Torrig was never going to secede from the Empire like Ulfric wanted, either because he believed Skyrim couldn't fight the elves alone, or because he didn't want to rip apart the Empire Tiber Septim built, or he was just a coward. Regardless of the reasoning behind both men, the facts remain the same. In the year 201 of the Fourth Era, Ulfric challenged High King Torrig to a traditional Nordic duel. which he was honor-bound to accept, despite knowing he was going to die. Credit where credit is due, Torrig didn't flinch. He took Ulfric head-on as best he could, even showing up in Sovngarde, meaning that at the very least the gods saw him as dying in battle and doing so honorably. And before anyone tries to say that him showing up in Sovngarde proves he was a good person and Ulfric murdered him unfairly, just remember that Ulfric also goes to Sovngarde if you kill him, so get back to me on that one. The Empire accused him of murder and treason, and Ulfric fled the city. He was led out by a sympathizer, and from then on, the Skyrim Civil War was well on its way. Why did I go on this history lesson? Because the second biggest point in the Stormcloak's favor behind an actual demigod showing up to help is that Ulfric probably has the relative popularity in Skyrim compared to the Imperials. You might not believe that. You might say that he's only popular among stupid racist Nords who don't know better, and you'd be right and wrong at the same time. Sure, folks love Elisif, but most couldn't care less about Tullius and whoever would replace him should the worst happen. Ulfric, on the other hand, is irreplaceable. The entire faction is named after him. Ulfric is a war hero who fought and freed Markarth from the Forsworn after the Imperials all but abandoned them. To be fair, the Empire was busy getting their teeth kicked in by the Thalmor who had just rolled up to the Imperial city, but good luck telling that to the people who just saw actual witch worshippers kick down the door and take over. All of this is context that should tell you why so many people in Skyrim side with Ulfric. As far as they're concerned, what happened to him is just the prime example of how the Empire and the Dominion would treat all of them in the same scenario. Combined with the outlawing of basically Nordic Jesus, Hammerfell proving that you can in fact be independent from the Empire and kick the Thalmor out of your country, and the many Nord lives lost during the Great War while the Dominion never even set foot in the province, and you have a recipe for a revolt. While I believe the Empire is more understandable than my fellow Stormcloaks may think, Hammerfell and Blackmarsh were clear indicators, at least to the Nords, that the Empire may need the provinces, but the provinces definitely don't need the Empire. And there was Ulfric, who had been at the forefront telling the Empire where they could shove the white gold concordat, and saying that the people of Skyrim didn't need the Empire anymore. With all that behind him, it's no real surprise that everywhere you go in Skyrim there's at least one person solidly in Ulfric's camp. Falkreath would probably be in its own mini-civil war between the two Jarls if it wasn't for it literally bordering Cyrodiil and having barely any people in the hold. Whether genuine or not, Ulfric standing up for the worship of Talos and the right and culture of the Skyrim earns him friends just about everywhere, even if those friends aren't immediately in charge. The Empire has a few of those too, but evidently not enough if they're putting people like Maven Blackbriar in charge. Corruption doesn't begin to describe that woman, and whoever's bank account she filled for that position deserves to be left on the border of the Aldmeri Dominion with their legs bound and a sign that says Khajiit are the best elves. The grander point is that Ulfric and the Stormcloaks have a lot of smaller advantages that keep them going, and if the stars align and Talos, or more likely Lorkhan, is on their side, then they could knock down the dominoes just right to bleed the Empire and Skyrim dry. But, short of Dragonborn intervention, that's a big if. The Empire, at least the part that's present in Skyrim, by default has the better resources, overall training, the better location, and more importantly, time. In a war of attrition, the one with time on their side is going to, more likely than not, leave the other side gasping. The Empire still has Cyrodiil and High Rock to the south and west, and while Bretons might not seem like the first thing you think of when I say dangerous, they are still more magically gifted than either Imperials or Nords. The Empire has Morrowind too, I guess, but they're a little busy with the whole nuclear winter thing. Still, Imperial troops can pass through and around that. Cyrodiil's climate and general geography is also far more fruitful when it comes to agriculture, which gives them food, which feeds an army of battle-hardened legionnaires who are also itching from the Great War that half the Stormcloaks fought in. The ones in Skyrim may be conscripts, and it may be a hard process to get troops in mass, but the Empire can afford to wait a bit longer than the Stormcloaks can. There's also a leadership advantage. With the Empire's forces, even a loss of direct leadership wouldn't mean an end to the Imperial resistance. Tullius' loss would be grave and damaging, and you can even kill the Emperor of all things during the game, but the Empire and its armies will keep moving forward, because the military structures in place will fill the gaps necessary, and the governmental structures in the Imperial City can run the military without an Emperor. Arguably, they'd be able to do it better without a central figure who could be a liability in the wrong circumstances. The Stormcloaks don't have that luxury. If Ulfric dies, that's the end of it. That's why Tullius likely wanted to end things as soon as possible in Helgen, ensuring that the rebellion died, Because if the Stormcloak part of the rebellion is gone, then the Empire has free reign to resettle the country. That is, if the Empire actually played their cards right, which they don't, but that's a whole other matter. In summation, the Stormcloak Rebellion is stuck in a war of attrition that has just enough ways to win that it would more than likely lead to a longer, more agonizing war for the entire province. However, luckily for them, the Dragonborn exists and is able to wrap up said war in record time. I mean, unless of course you choose Imperial, you mongrel dog of the Empire. But that will be all from me, your friendly neighborhood soldier in blue, fighting for the right to worship our God Emperor against those filthy elves. Wait a minute. If I had a nickel for every time I played a game where a blue-toned northern kingdom of honor-loving traditionalists went to war over a religious issue against an overextending red-themed empire while a yellow-themed faction watched on from the distance, I'd have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. Wait, didn't I already make this joke for triangle strategy? It's not exactly the same, but hold on. Kingdom of honor-loving traditionalists, religious war. Wow. Crazy how that works. Only 2 red-themed empires, though. Unlike that other red empire, though, this one has the life expectancy of a fly on cocaine. The Empire of Tiber Septim has gone through a lot of rough patches throughout its near 1,000 years of history. From a nutjob emperor and his necromancer mother, to one of the Uriels deciding that one continent wasn't enough and picked a fight with Tamriel's eastern neighbor of Akavir, only to disappear with an entire fleet and army. Probably because invading the continent inhabited by snake people and demons of the non-oblivion variety is categorically a bad idea. But none of that comes close to how precarious the Empire's situation is by the time of the 4th Era. Howdy! I am the Hearth Guy, and this week in my slow but certain decline into madness, I am covering another slow and certain decline. That of the Cyrodiilic Empire of Tiber Septim, the second primary faction in the events of Skyrim. Because I spent the first video explaining why the group I actually side with was on a long walk off a short cliff, so just imagine what I have to say about the mongrel dogs of the Empire, like the second best mortal-turned-god would call them. Sorry, Dagothur, you're a funny man, but my loyalty belongs to my boy Talos. As compared to the Stormcloaks who started off poorly, we have 2 centuries of increasing problems to use as reference for the Empire's sad state of affairs. The Oblivion Crisis was bad, but at least the Empire was united, or as united as they can be against the equivalent of hell itself sucker-punching an entire continent. Morrowind was being kicked while it was down, and Blackmarsh was doing its own thing so well that it's become a meme thanks to the alien trees, but at least at the time, there was a clear way to win. Get the amulet, get Sean Bean, flex tape the holes in the world. 200 years later, and things have gotten significantly worse. Blackmarsh clowning on Oblivion went from a meme to a problem as they decided they were better off without the leaderless mess of an empire, and so they seceded immediately following the crisis. Things weren't much better in the other parts of Tamriel. Morrowind was already a hellish nightmarescape since the false tribunal died or dipped and a meteor fell on the place, so the Daedra invading was more or less par for the course. But everywhere else that didn't have Ents with psychedelic blood was barely functioning. The Elder Council was trying to keep the peace and figure out how to replace a millennia-old dynasty of demigods. They probably would have chosen the Champion of Cyrodiil if they hadn't found a more lucrative position as an eldritch horror with every mental disorder. So what remained of the Empire was slowly crawling itself back into a vaguely functional place. And by vaguely functional, I mean Hammerfell was in like its 50th civil war. Skyrim had been and was going through what could only be described as cultural colonization by the Empire. Valenwood and elsewhere got conquered by the literal worst people ever, aka the Aldmeri Dominion, and Cyrodiil's intermediate ruler got assassinated, probably by the Thalmor, and the rest of the country got busy with several warlords fighting for supremacy until one Titus Mede I came out on top as the new, not-so-demigod emperor of the similarly not-so-great empire. This was all relatively early into the 4th Era, and it didn't really improve from there on out. The heroes and frameworks of the last era were gone, and the Empire was trying all it could to hold on to the barest scraps of legitimacy, as the Aldmeri Dominion was the new hot superpower on the block. Inevitably, this led to the event which everyone can't stop yapping about in Skyrim, the Great War, which, based off how it ended and the obvious real-world parallels, is bound to get a sequel pretty soon. I figure most of us here know the broad strokes from this over a decade-old video game that is synonymous with fantasy itself by this point, but if you don't, Pancreas No Work made a way better video than this about the war, so check that out for a full rundown. The broad strokes are these. The Thalmor walked up to the Emperor with a cart, demanded he give up the southern part of Hammerfell, outlaw the worship of Talos, the god emperor who founded the whole thing and kicked the Thalmor's butt centuries ago, disband the samurai secret service organization that is the Blades, and pay them a bunch of money. The Emperor, Titus Mede II, did what any reasonable man would do, and told them to take their knife ears and demands and go back to the eugenics-ridden backwater they came from. To this, the Thalmor tipped over the cart and revealed the heads of a bunch of already dead Blades, and bing bang boom, the Great War began. That went on for a long time, and Titus Mede managed to, by the grace of Talos and Akatosh no doubt, scrape by long enough to pull off a tie. Not a victory, mind you. A tie. Although you wouldn't be able to tell from the aftermath. The Imperial City had been sacked, Titus running from his own capital to prolong the war effort while Hammerfell was ravaged by the conflict, and Skyrim had opened the floodgates to send out the greatest secret weapon of the Empire. Nords. A lot of people died, and everywhere that wasn't Skyrim, Blackmarsh, and the Somerset Isles were feeling the pain. Yeah, I know Morrowind never got hit either, but they're always feeling pain. It just generally sucks to be in Morrowind. And at that time, it generally sucked to be Titus Mede II. He outlasted the onslaught of the Dominion, but regardless, he still wound up signing into law the demands of the Thalmor, known as the White Gold Concordat. No more Blades, no more Talos, and sure, they can take that land that Hammerfell just spent 5 years fighting to protect. Yeah, Hammerfell saw that as a raw deal and kept fighting as they believed the Empire should have done and could have done if they wanted to, forcing the Emperor to allow them to become independent. 5 years and a lot more bloodshed later, Hammerfell pushed back the elves and seemingly legitimized their own beliefs. Maybe if they had kept fighting, the Empire could have won. But it was too late now. The Blades were disbanded and all their agents were allowed to be hunted by the Thalmor, and just the same, any worshippers of Talos were rounded up and mercilessly persecuted for their beliefs. Pretty much everyone in the Empire who was still in the Empire was pretty unhappy with this arrangement to varying degrees. On a scale of disgruntled to let's all go down to Dixie, let's just say Skyrim, where thousands of Nords came from to die for an empire that gutted the worship of the most important remaining god to the Nords and who left Hammerfell to the wolves at the Dominion's request, was feeling a little bit peeved, and the voice of that frustration became Ulfric Stormcloak. I already covered him and his rebellion in the last video though. This is about the ones he's fighting against and losing to. The Imperial Legion, or just the Imperials. The Imperials of Skyrim, quite frankly, hold all the cards. They've got the best port, which is Solitude, sucks to suck Dawnstar, which serves as a constant source of supplies and occasional reinforcements to the base of their operations in Skyrim. Windhelm also has a port and admittedly is a better defended one as it's further down an icy river that likely they alone know how to traverse, but the Stormcloaks have no real navy and therefore no way to realistically fend off a blockade or other maritime shenanigans. They've got the many mines of the Reach that provide ample and reliable weapons and armor as well as the silver of Markarth's Sidna mine. The wealth generated from the Reach could bankroll an entirely third separate army and still give them a decent chance. The Reach does have a Forsworn problem, but they are usually a negligible issue. The forests and fields of Falkreath, though relatively sparsely populated, are vast. Though Riften's breadbasket is indeed superior, the amount of lumber that can be feasibly churned out from Falkreath's mills outweigh anything in Stormcloak territory. Morthal is doing something, I'm sure. And when push comes to shove, Whiterun joins up with them, which gives the wide-open plains and farmland of Skyrim's center. And as the center, the Whiterun hold gives points of attack for both Dawnstar and Windhelm directly. Whereas even if the Stormcloaks had Whiterun, they'd still have to go through Morthal to get to Solitude. Oh, hey, that's something Morthal does. Act as a land-based obstacle for the land-based Stormcloak army. You try marching an army covered head to toe in heavy armor and weapons through a swamp and tell me if that's not an effective deterrent. Not to mention the vampires, the undead, the spiders, and Talos only knows what else haunting the marshes. The vast majority of their army is made up of conscripts, but the leadership positions are made up of real legionnaires with training and experience, many of which fought in the Great War as well. Legate Rikke is a Nord veteran of that war, and she, like many of the Imperial commanders you'll meet, are more akin to proper legionnaires than many of the on-hand conscripts they had to rustle up on short notice. But that direction works wonders when actually able to be utilized. The Stormcloaks also have veteran soldiers like that, such as Galmar Stonefist or Ulfric himself, but with the geography that the Imperials are actually working with, they'll have a better time actually using that experience, since most of the lands in Stormcloak territory are icy winter wonderlands. Now, admittedly, that's if we're thinking defensively, which is what the Imperials should be doing. since they have the benefit of time that the Stormcloaks don't. But the Imperials sadly aren't using that opportunity. The only reason Skyrim isn't flooded with troops this instant is as though Talos himself was mad at them. The mountain passes that connect Skyrim to the rest of the continent are blocked by avalanches and winter conditions. Despite this, the Imperial army seems to be trying to fight a conventional war rather than just waiting out the Stormcloaks and defending their lines, which is either a very poor strategy or indicative of how thin the Empire's resources actually are. What's more, they've got backup from the East Empire Company, the biggest commercial power in the Empire and one directly controlled by the Emperor, which is headed up in Skyrim by the Emperor's own cousin. Of course, it'd be a shame if something happened to her, but I digress. The East Empire Company does suffer some setbacks from interference by the Stormcloak-backed regional competitors of the Shatter Shields. However, it's a problem that is ultimately solved and ends with the company no longer docking in Windhelm. Why it was docking in Windhelm and why it maintained an open office in the capital of a rebellion is beyond me, but hey, this is the age of mercantilism. There's only so much to go around, so you do what you gotta do. To the west, High Rock has an honestly diverse array of resources and wealth, but it is somewhat disconnected from the entire situation, partly because of constant infighting. However, they are at least comfortably loyal to the Empire, as shown by them ghosting Ulfric when he wrote to them, asking if they'd be interested in also rebelling. Of course, they also have the entire agricultural power of Cyrodiil to the south, which makes the Rift look sad in comparison. While admittedly, Cyrodiil is diverting a lot of resources into a lot of places, and has trouble doing so to Skyrim because of the few land-based passes to Skyrim being blocked, those resources are still there. They aren't going anywhere, unlike the Rift, since that one hold has to be feeding the entire Stormcloak rebellion at any given time. Now, call a spade, the Empire does have some disadvantages in this little war of succession, and a lot of them are rooted in the people in charge. The whole Imperial cause is rallied around putting Jarl Elisif the Fair, widow to High King Torrig, on the throne of Skyrim. And that might just be the worst look you could possibly have. Because, plain and simple, Elisif is not going to be the leader of Skyrim. If you're on the side of the Imperials, you aren't doing it for Elisif. Well, some of you might, but that's just because you're simps that haven't realized you can't actually marry her without mods. No, if you're an Imperial, you're fighting so the Empire can appoint another monarch of Skyrim, and said monarch can get back to doing nothing because the Empire is taking care of everything. Or as much as they can, because again, looming continental war. Obviously, that kind of idea leaves a bad taste in the mouth of anyone with some sense, even Elisif's own advisors. But in their minds, it's the more practical solution. And they've been doing it for generations, so why stop now? Then there's Tullius, the actual leader of the Imperial cause, and allow me to let my inner Stormcloak come out a bit, because I find the flaming hypocrisy surrounding Tullius to just be the most egregious part about him. I'm not saying Tullius is a hypocrite. No, he at least is able to admit that this is all just orders for him. No, I'm talking about the hypocrisy in regard to how people compare Tullius to Ulfric. Here comes a hot take, because one of the biggest complaints and accusations labeled towards Ulfric and the Stormcloaks is that they're a bunch of racists who hate anyone who isn't a Nord. And while you can make that argument for plenty of Stormcloak sympathizers, Ulfric himself is ambivalent at worst. He's not really happy that his city was given Dark Elves and Argonians to care for even before he became Jarl, but he's also not bothering to go after them because he's got bigger fish to fry. Ulfric and most Stormcloak's biggest grievances with the Dark Elves of Windhelm are that while they live in their city and on their land, they also don't actively help with the Stormcloak cause. Which is also the same problem the Imperials have with, the entire city of Whiterun. The Stormcloak credo of Skyrim's For the Nords is the exact same kind of line you'll hear if you go to literally any other province in Tamriel, especially Morrowind or Blackmarsh. Allow me to remind you that the reason Argonians and Dark Elves are kept separated is because it was the Dark Elves viciously enslaving the Argonians for centuries, and then the Argonians doing it right back. Why do I bring this all up? Because Tullius is a racist. And if he isn't racist, he's just a general, get it, douchebag, specifically towards Nords, which sounds pretty racist to me. He constantly belittles the traditions of the Nords, their culture and way of life. Yeah, he's not thrilled to be in this situation and very clearly would rather be anywhere else, but at least Ulfric isn't going on a tangent every 5 minutes complaining about Dark Elves. Which is doubly insulting because his own right-hand woman is a Nord who has just as much respect for her culture and traditions as Ulfric or Galmar Stonefist do, as she was once a comrade to them in the Great War. But does that make Tullius even once respect or try to sympathize with Nords like her who love their people and the Empire? Nope, not at all. Also, daily reminder that every hold and every Jarl on both sides refuses to let Khajiit into their cities. This is Tamriel. Everyone is racist. especially to the cats. Despite this, they also all allow you as any race to join their armies, and while you could chalk that up to video game logic, it's still a part of the story. Galmar is honestly understandably confused if a non-Nord wants to join the Skyrim is for the Nords group, but he's pretty quick to accept the help if you hate the Empire as much as they all do. The reverse is also true for the Empire, so while we can argue all day about the personal scruples of their leaders, neither are especially picky about who they get to help them. Which naturally segues into the fact that the Empire technically has the Aldmeri Dominion on their side with their vast information network. But let's be honest here, that's the sharpest double-edged sword this side of Clavicus Vile. The Thalmor spies were and are better than even the Blades or Penitus Oculatus, and they actively have a presence in the Stormcloak army in some capacity in two forms. One, they quietly supply them to some degree because they want the slaughter to go on as long as possible, and two, they have actual physical spies in the army which have resulted in such things as Ulfric's capture right before the beginnings of the game. Though it's possible those were just plain Imperial spies, as the Thalmor want this war to go on as long as possible, so having Ulfric captured kind of throws that plan out the window. Oh, also the dragons are back. Because some divine entity is very upset right now, and it's either Talos, Lorcan, or Akatosh. Said dragons actually caused the war to go on longer because Alduin swooped in to accidentally save a captured Ulfric from a close shave by an Imperial headsman. This was only because Alduin was after the Dragonborn, I assume. But either way, the Imperials is just having the worst timing. If luck could be quantified, though I don't believe in it, the Imperials would rank somewhere in the negative double digits because wow is it bad. They managed to capture Ulfric thanks to their spies, but General Tullius moved to execute Ulfric early because he likely thought the Thalmor would try to arrange for Ulfric to escape, because as everyone in this entire situation knows, this war lasting a long time only benefits the elves. However, instead he managed to get the soon-to-be Dragonborn wrapped up in it, and most reasonable people wouldn't want to side with the people who just tried to execute you needlessly because of circumstances. If that wasn't bad enough, the dragon problem is assaulting everyone, and that's one more issue the Imperials have to manage while somehow preparing for an inevitable Second Great War. And it's not even like the Imperials have some kind of fervor to them like the Stormcloaks do. Every single one of them is pretty pessimistic about the Empire situation, even if they think they can win the Civil War. Because if you think about it, even with Skyrim still in place, they barely survived last time around, and they had to sacrifice a lot to see another day. And that was when everybody was on the same page and Hammerfell was still a part of the Empire. Let's do the math. Skyrim's biggest export militarily is going to be lumber and soldiers, because boy do those Nords like killing elves. I mean, when you really think about it, it's in their blood thanks to Ysgramor. But remove them, what else does the Empire have? Morrowind is, as established, constantly suffering, and from what I've heard, might not actually be a part of the Empire, but is still closely associated with them, considering the East Empire Company visits Solstheim. High Rock's biggest issue is how disconnected it is from the main fight, especially now that Hammerfell isn't necessarily friendly territory. Also, doesn't help that High Rock is regularly split into various competing petty kingdoms, but for the most part, they put that bickering aside when dealing with outside threats. It remains a frequent problem for the province as a whole. The Empire has been rotting since the death of the last Septim, and the Elder Council has grown in power and corruption. Even under the newer Mede dynasty, the Empire has struggled to hold up the crumbling foundations due to a lack of legitimacy and the encroaching threat of the Dominion. If anything, the White Gold Concordat, which was signed at the end of the Great War, only further shattered the validity of the new dynasty and its rulers. Perhaps this is why members of the Elder Council plot for the death of Titus Mede II, as seen in the Dark Brotherhood questline. Perhaps the Emperor or his dynasties does not fit what the Council believes the Empire needs. The way I see it, Titus Mede is likely raring for a second shot at the Great War and hoping the Empire is ready for it. But the Elder Council may not be so confident. Or maybe the reverse is true. Maybe Mede wants to hold back and capitulate while the Council wants to tear the old treaty up and head to a war the Empire feels is doomed to fail. Or, and this is the most speculative, maybe this is the Emperor's plan as well. Maybe he too knows the time has come for someone new to take the throne, as well as create a tragedy for the Empire to rally around. But it's hard to say. The only thing I can say for certain is that the belief of the average person in the Empire, at least as seen in Skyrim, is waning. Even the staunchest of Imperial defenders, like the one and only General Tullius, agree with what Ulfric has to say about the Empire and what it's become. Sure, they're fighting so they have a more united front in the future, but will they really? They already lost Hammerfell. Even a subdued Skyrim will be war-torn and ragged. Morrowind is Morrowind. And High Rock is even more severed now. Remove Skyrim from the Empire, and High Rock is also on its own, as the last land link will be gone. And even if they kept Skyrim, High Rock wasn't very useful the last time around anyways. The best the Empire can hope for is to somehow hold the line the next time the Thalmor come knocking. But it will be far from united. Even when it was unified, they had their world rocked for 5 years straight. If the domino of Skyrim falls, then everything they fought for is doomed. Or is it? You'd think the Thalmor would just blatantly support the Stormcloaks if an independent Skyrim meant the end of the Empire, but it's possible that's not quite true. Consider that by the nature of an empire, the larger an institution is, the harder it becomes to manage. One of the biggest weaknesses of the Empire in the First Great War was their slow reaction in the early days of the war. With a near-continent spanning empire, plans and battle lines will be slow to form, especially when on the defensive. But if all the Empire, or rather Cyrodiil, had to worry about was itself, and could centralize its power, what would change? Hammerfell and Cyrodiil were the front lines of the last war, and Hammerfell has proven its ability to hold back and even repel an Elvish invasion alone. Add to this that Ulfric himself expresses a desire, willingness, and understanding that Skyrim's forces would be needed away from the homeland when the greater evil of the Dominion comes calling. If he wins and gets Skyrim, he knows that fighting the Empire further accomplishes nothing. That is what the Thalmor want to prevent. They want the war to continue on. They want the season unending. They want the war to keep on moving without reprieve because the longer they fight, not only does it drain resources and manpower, but it also sows deeper dissent and grudges. If an independent Skyrim, or even a subjugated one, can't stand to look at their imperial neighbors, then how willing will they be to fight for them? An easy, quick ending to the war means the chances for past woes to be forgotten by the time the naturally slower to rebuild and repopulate elves are ready for round 2, which means a higher chance for the now independent nations of man to unite against their elven foes. But that's a story for another day. Instead, for now, I want to leave off with this. For everyone fighting so hard and so fervently to maintain the empire of Tiber Septim, I think it's important to remember that this is not the first time an empire has existed in Cyrodiil. This is the third. First there was Alesia, then Riemann Cyrodiil, and finally Tiber Septim. In fact, every time that it seems an empire will collapse forever, some aspect of Shor, Lorkhan, Shezar, whatever name you want to give him, shows up to save the day and kill a whole lot of elves. It's happened once, and it will no doubt happen again. And after almost 1,000 years, it might be time for the next cycle to begin. Humanity has an interesting relationship with the idea of elves. In an act of either humility or self-deprecation, depending on your perspective, we almost always depict elves as something intrinsically better than humans. Whether that be magically, culturally, emotionally, etc. It's honestly kind of insufferable at some points, but I can't help but admit there's a certain mystique to the elves of Tolkien, Dungeons & Dragons, Warhammer, and... well, there's an exception to every rule. I do my best, my darn tootinest, to be as unbiased as I can be. I put aside my love or hate for certain groups or factions in the name of delivering what I see as pretty direct and logical analyses of everything from logistics, history, to even taking into account real-world history or precedents as to why one side or another might win or lose, or where they might be going. As you might know, I may love the Stormcloaks and hate the Imperials, but in the totem pole of hatred and spite, the one that stands above them all is the Aldmeri Dominion, the undisputed most hateable superpower in all of Tamriel. Hello, I am the Hearth Guy, and let's talk about why no one's favorite elves are no doubt taking a long walk off a short pier by not only logistical reasons, but also based off their own history and the history of Tamriel itself. This time, I don't have to worry about upsetting anyone. There are no Dominion defenders, and if you think you are, you're not. You're just an elf simp. But these elves are not deserving of such adoration. These elves are only deserving of being broken on the blade of the next aspect of Lorkhan who comes walking up to kill them all. Okay, I know that sounds bad, but seriously, Dominion, or rather the Thalmor, deserve it. Although to be clear, there isn't really a distinction. The Thalmor is the governing body of the Third Aldmeri Dominion, and honestly, it's comedically evil, and somehow, despite historically everything they try going right for them, it's still hilariously incompetent. And even if they weren't, the stars are almost destined to align so that they will be humbled back into the dirt where they belong. So, let's be clear here. Yes, the Aldmeri Dominion did technically win the Great War insofar as they got everything they wanted out of it. They got the destruction of the Blades, they got the outlawing of Talos worship, they got the south of Hammerfell. Oh, well, actually, we'll have to get back to you on that one. The final result of the war was a draw, with the Aldmeri Dominion in Cyrodiil totally obliterated by the last-ditch efforts of the Empire, while the army in Hammerfell was stalemated. With the losses on both sides mounting, a truce was written up called the White Gold Concordat, although the terms, as mentioned before, were heavily skewed one way. I However, it does go overlooked how much of an effort that was on the Dominion's part. Their biggest advantage, especially early on, was their preparation for the Great War, one that the Empire didn't really see coming. The Dominion had to hunt down every blade in their territories and avoid suspicion, all while building the army. It worked, of course, but that relied on circumstances that the Empire, or whatever collection of independent nations they'll be fighting in Round 2, won't be susceptible to. They also had a plethora of magical and Daedric artifacts to throw around, like the Orb of Vermina, and were trying to perform some kind of ritual or prophecy called the Culling that was supposed to summon hordes of Daedra to Tamriel. Because no one can learn from their lesson. This is all a thing because the Elder Scrolls Legends game is weird. Needless to say, the advantages they had in the First War are no doubt gone, and it's clear they've been trying to set themselves up for success ever since. The meddling with the Skyrim Civil War especially, since the Nords have to be the single most consistent nightmare to any elf in Tamriel, since before recorded dates. There's an age-old debate about Ulfric being an asset to the Thalmor, but to be clear, an asset does not mean that he is some two-faced traitor working for the Thalmor. What it means is that he's a person of interest whose actions can be seen as valuable to the Thalmor, and one who they'd made contact with, namely that time they captured him. However, it's also noted that he has since been uncooperative in their own words. So even if you wanted to think he was once a mole or whatever, he's clearly no longer aiding them knowingly. The reverse is not necessarily the case though, as the Thalmor are more than happy to finance and equip the Stormcloaks to make the war go on as long as possible. The idea being, of course, that the longer the war goes on, then the less resources and more grudges both will have no matter who actually wins. From the Elves' perspective, it likely seemed that separating the Empire down to independent provinces would be the best solution, particularly in this case, as the removal of Skyrim also effectively cuts off High Rock from the Empire, totally dismantling the system. Obviously, having the Bozos fight forever would be the best outcome, but they'll probably settle for destabilizing their biggest enemies. However, it's not hard to see how this could backfire tremendously. Assuming the war with the Empire in Skyrim does end with a Stormcloak victory, what then? The Thalmor are still in a preparatory phase where they have to rebuild their forces in numbers. After all, as elves, they reproduce slower and therefore their armies take longer to reinforce. Not to mention they're relying on the manpower of 3 nations against the possible combined might of 6, if we assume the peace negotiations between the Empire and Blackmarsh, although we have no actual info on how those went. Blackmarsh is busted in the kind of way that they invaded Oblivion so hard that Maroon's Dagon had to take his satanic warp gates back and go home. Turns out the magical trees with acid steroid sap are a pretty effective counter to invasion, and if you throw those bad boys into a conventional fight, they can be just as deadly. And Argonians have perhaps even less reason to like the elves than they do humans. Hammerfell is still able and willing to throw down with the folks they kicked out before, and seem to be working to get ready for that inevitability, rooting out any possible traitors in their midst and fortifying their borders. If they could get united sooner than they did in the Great War, then they'd be in a solid position to again keep the Dominion from advancing into their country. North of them is High Rock, who wasn't really hurt all that much from the Great War to begin with, and it was somewhat useless admittedly in the grand scheme of things. But with the greatest cavalry and home to the most magically inclined humans on the continent in the Bretons, a solo kingdom of High Rock allied to its neighbors and being proactive would be a threat to an elvish invasion. Also, to be totally fair, Orsinium is there, but it's barely an actual place and has never been recognized as an official province or homeland. However, orcs remain orcs, and they have a tendency to beat elf faces in as much as Nords do, with, quite frankly, weapons and blacksmithing that rival the Nords. Don't tell the companions I said that. Of course, the Empire, which is not close to 1,000 years old. There, are you guys happy? I swear, I make one error and I'm banished to the Soul Cairn. Anyway, the Empire, or just Cyrodiil, has been preparing for just as long as the Dominion has been. They can do so faster, at least when it comes to manpower. Imperial strategy and gift for warfare is outmatched only by the Nords and the Orcs, and that's because those two have been part of the Empire since almost its inception. Not to mention all the advantages I listed in the last video, such as the East Empire Company's economic power, and how a Cyrodiil on its own could centralize its vast resources far better towards defending itself on its own borders with the Dominion without needing to worry as much with Hammerfell, since they can clearly handle themselves. As for Skyrim, Ulfric makes it plain and clear that his rebellion is just a prelude to the actual battle with the Dominion. So a Stormcloak Skyrim would be on the front lines just like in the last Great War, only this time they're calling their own shots. Perhaps just as it was always meant to be. One could even argue that a Stormcloak victory in Skyrim would destabilize Thalmor activities across the northern part of the Empire, leaving only Cyrodiil for them to be able to interfere with, which becomes even more difficult if the Empire only has itself to worry about and can focus the Penitus Oculatus into the one province. Morrowind is still Morrowind, but to be fair, they are getting better slowly. The Dunmer have never been on board with their fairer cousins, and few others can match elvish magic pound for pound like another elf can. Just, maybe don't ask the Telvanni to get involved if you actually want Morrowind and Blackmarsh to work together. All while the Thalmor slowly wear out its welcome in at least a few places. Valenwood, for instance, has an increasing number of dissidents. Do they frequently get massacred? Yes, but more and more are getting sick of their high elf cousins who cooed their way into power in the first place. After close to 2 centuries of enforced dictatorial rule, the cracks are bound to start showing. If they do, then elsewhere is also going to be right behind them, as evidently there are Khajiit resistance movements among their kingdoms as well. Realistically, all it'd take for the Dominion to come unraveled would be for Valenwood to fight back. Likely why the Thalmor are so dead set on keeping it subservient. As for the last province, the Somerset Isles themselves, it's sad to say that they are likely too far gone into the hole of the Thalmor's corruption, as they had all dissidents scrubbed clean and exterminated back when the Thalmor took control in the wake of the Oblivion Crisis. These days, any remaining High Elves have either fully bought into their leadership's insanity or are smart enough to keep quiet about it. The one exception being the mysterious Sigic Order, a seemingly all-powerful order of monks and mages with the power to freeze time and warp space, but they are still too small a force to turn the tables on the Thalmor alone. If the best-case scenario happens and the sky does come falling down for the Dominion, then you can bet that the Sigics would be on the side of whatever kind of alliance or reborn empire is kicking down the door of the Thalmor to reenact the fall of the Ayleids. In a practical sense, the Thalmor are running down the amount of power they can exert without winding up in a full-blown popular revolt. And if that were to ever happen, you can bet that everyone, Imperial or Stormcloak, would stop fighting each other and start killing elves as soon as possible. End of the day, both sides want the same thing. Dead Thalmor. They just have interpersonal drama that prevents working together. But if the Thalmor ever makes an opening obvious, that drama is going to be forgotten real fast. Nothing buries hatchets quite like the fumbling of a shared enemy. Well, except maybe a shared hero. And that's a genuine thing to consider because we're not dealing in just real-world logistics and social or historical trends. We're in Tamriel, a world of magic and actual gods. One god in particular that has a tendency to send a champion whenever elves of some kind get uppity, of which I am naturally referring to Lorkhan, or Shizar, whatever name you want for the missing 9th divine that Talos almost certainly was also a champion of. It seems whenever humanity is on the brink, their semi-dead Super Papa drops in an embodiment of himself to become the main character of the planet for a few decades. These individuals are generally called Shezarines, such as, probably, Perennial Whitestrake, although he is a whole can of worms I have no time or brain cells to explain here and now. And like I said, Talos, aka Tiber Septim, aka Ysmir, was almost certainly both a Shezarine and actually definitely a Dragonborn, which is honestly a funny trend I've noticed. Whenever an aspect or champion of Lorkhan is around to save the day, they almost always team up with or are also a Dragonborn. In other words, a child of Akatosh, the dragon god of time, whose elf aspect Auriel was responsible for killing Lorkhan in the first place. That's an oversimplification, but still. God lore is complicated. I wonder if there's some kind of reason for Auriel constantly teaming up with Lorkhan in that way, at least indirectly. If so, it's very funny to think that even the god the elves pray to hates them so bad he'd rather team up with his oldest rival than just let them win. Doubly funny that the Thalmor are stupidly trying to erase Talos worship whenever said man was a Dragonborn and therefore a chosen of Akatosh/Auriel. Seems like even these clowns don't know what they want. I simply posit one question to the Thalmor. If Talos wasn't a god, then why does his shrines give blessings, and why in Oblivion could his armor count as an artifact of the Aedra? Checkmate, elves. Go back to your stupid island where you belong, because I have an axe that's especially deadly against you and I'm ready to finish the job Ys Grimoire and Perennial Whitestrake started. As you may have noticed, I'm, not too fond of these bunch. Personally, I don't got anything against the High Elves themselves, but at this point the Thalmor are the High Elves because they killed everybody who didn't agree with them. On the topic of Talos, there's some kind of speculation that the Thalmor are trying to erase Talos by getting rid of worship of him, which personally doesn't make much sense. As best I can tell, the power of a god is not equal to their worshipper count, and even if it was, Talos achieved Chim in life, so why would he be reliant on worship as a god? And please, don't try and ask me to explain Chim, it's not worth it. Just trust me when I say that because he achieved it, he didn't need to be worshipped to gain superpowers. This is all to say that the gods tend to have a guardrail in place in case of widespread human death, and it's a guardrail that has yet to fail. Looking at the many times such heroes and legends have risen up to teach elves, Daedra, or whatever a lesson, the hands of the divine are often behind them. Though it's a weird habit of theirs to keep picking prisoners, criminals, and the like to be their champions, but who am I to judge? Also, one time it was Azura, but, that's just splitting hairs. And in the modern day, that hero would be the last Dragonborn, who, no matter what side they're on, is firmly against the Thalmor as a product of the main story. What's more, they reinvigorate the Blades within the province and secure regional victory for at least one side of the Civil War factions. I've spoken about those factions, and the Blades are frankly a bunch of wash-ups from how they used to be, but if we were considering this from a continent standpoint, then the Dragonborn could and would have all the reason in the world to side with anyone that was out to kill the Thalmor. And if you have the dragon-slaying, world-saving, sun-protecting, god-blessed, Daedra-messed final Dovahkiin running at you with 500 bottles of skooma and armor made from the bodies of dead demigods, then I just want you to try and stop them. But unfortunately, this is Bethesda, and we all know that the last Dragonborn is probably going to be shipped off to some vague hammer space where they can't bother Todd Howard's flawless narrative. Yes, I know other people write the story, but I can still blame Todd Howard for it. So without the Dragonborn, chances are someone is going to manifest a champion to kick the High Elves down and make the third Aldmeri Dominion into the last Aldmeri Dominion. And before anyone calls it a cop-out answer that hinges on the meta-knowledge of the fact that Bethesda wouldn't just kill off their whole world, this sort of thing is so common in Elder Scrolls, it's a wonder that people haven't started trying to actively cause a Shezarene to show up and save humanity. It's even debatable if the Forgotten Hero, the stupid hero they invented for the card game that replaced Titus Mead in the final battle of the Great War, could also count as one such hero, since they pass all the same standards for some divine-sent MacGuffin of a person. But admittedly, yes, it's a bit hokey to rely solely on the argument of canonical and historical consistent Deus Ex Machina. So, how could this whole thing actually play out? Well, I can't profess to know for certain what Bethesda is cooking, but I'll just say what I think would be the best outcome narratively, and perhaps more likely. First, independent Skyrim, and before you whine about Stormcloak bias, this is a necessity for an overall theme here. Independent Skyrim allies with High Rock and Hammerfell in the wake of an obviously approaching war with the Aldmeri Dominion, while Black Marsh and Cyrodiil's negotiations go through for a complete alliance with Morrowind sort of just being there. These two loose alliances are then barely cooperating each other as the Aldmeri Dominion begins another two-pronged war on Tamriel, but this time the Imperial legions are solely focused in Cyrodiil, while the Argonians can defend their own borders and help out with the empires. In the northwest, Skyrim's Stormcloak army, fresh from its recent civil war, is more than happy to get the much-desired revenge against the Thalmor, and heads to the front lines in the south of Hammerfell. Presumably, there'd be a period of struggle for the Nords getting used to the new terrain and heat, but they get into the swing of things because there's murder to be done. At first, High Rock is again useless, but because it's now a bundle of independent nations, the Dominion might get cocky, thinking they can attack with their navy, leading to a stern defense from northern Hammerfell and High Rock. In the chaos, Orsinium is able to distinguish itself and earn the respect and equal footing it wants now that it doesn't have to worry about the Empire's refusal to acknowledge the territory. Meanwhile, down south, Argonians and Dark Elves have to work separately for the most part, but Imperial leadership, perhaps even under a new Emperor, is keeping everyone working together. Without the element of surprise or fancy magic artifacts, the Aldmeri is forced to fight more conventionally, but are slowly whittling their forces down against the multiple fronts. That is, until they start focusing all their forces into Cyrodiil, figuring that if they could take it back when it was still the Empire, they could do it now, Argonians or not. And as it starts to work, they push deeper and deeper into the Heartland until once more it looks like it's going to be a repeat of the sacking of the Imperial City. Until the Men of the North come calling. Noticing the lightened Elvish forces on their own borders and knowing full well what the collapse of Cyrodiil will mean, the disgruntled Nords and Redguards and the more willing Bretons and Orcs march south for a proper continental struggle. Perhaps seeing an opportunity, a Valenwood-based revolt could begin and shake the Dominion at the worst possible time. This infighting could stretch over to elsewhere with its own resistance groups gaining more traction and allies with their neighbors. And, bing bang boom, it's a full-scale dogfight as chaos erupts over the continent, with at least a third of the people involved not fully knowing who they should be fighting. However, that chaos wears down whatever strength the Dominion could muster in the measly few decades after the Great War, as they could never hope to match the fortitude and ability to recover that is found in the races of men, and now their own elvish cousins. And the beast folks, who just want to be left alone for once. As the Dominion begins to collapse, riots of those who either hid their true sentiments or began to realize the truth break out over the Somerset Isles. And depending on how truly screwed you want them to be, the Psijic Order could even pop in to hammer in the final blow as all their enemies close in around them. By the end of it, every province could be independent while also standing together as their shared enemy is defeated. Would they reorganize into a new empire? Would some reform into new kingdoms like the old days of the Three Banners in the Second Era? Perhaps they'll all start fighting each other again until something stupid happens like the Khajiit takeover. Actually, you know what? Maybe the Khajiit should take over. Finally let the beast folk have a turn ruling the entire continent. However the dust settles, Tamriel will have a way forward, and more likely than not, some new god-blessed hero leading the charge and rallying the troops. But even without, all the pieces exist for Tamriel's people to prove they don't need to be bound by a single empire to stand united for protection. An example of true unification rather than the domination of the Thalmor. Will we get that kind of ending? No. This is still Bethesda, and from the sounds of it, Elder Scrolls 6 is going to be interesting, to say the least. But hey, we can still hope and pray that someone over there wants to add some actual stakes or consequences to people's actions. Until then, we can only look to the horizon and wonder. Thank you as always for watching this video. If you follow the community posts, then you know that I have heard your words. They have whispered into my mind with the piercing sounds of Meridia as I pick up that stupid rock. I will continue delving into the non-Civil War related factions, their characters, and their frankly questionable legitimacy as factions. If that sounds like a good time to all of you, then consider liking, commenting, and subscribing, and even sharing the video around. A shout out to my patrons whose support has continued to be invaluable as I trudge ever towards that much coveted 5,000 subscribers. So close, I can taste it. If you'd also like to support me, one, obviously you can subscribe, but if you have the means and desire to, consider becoming a patron or YouTube member. Both give access to early content that comes out hours or even days earlier than everyone else, and a private Discord server where you can interact with me personally and have a relaxing part of the internet to hang out in. If that sounds good to you, then consider giving if you can. With that all said and done, I have been the Hearth Guy, and I will see you all next time, around the hearth. Surprisingly enough, I think the Sigic Order could be the future of the High Elves once the Eldmeri Dominion are out of the picture. With 2 centuries of Thalmor indoctrination and dictatorship, perhaps a lighter hand of a much older group could be the cultural leader that the Isles need. A real shame Skyrim doesn't have a magical organization like that.